Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this is a video about the King James Bible. And here I am at Hampton Court Palace, which you can see behind me. And Hampton Court Palace is where the King James Bible was first authorized, because it was here in February 1604 that King James I held his Hampton Court Conference, and it was decided that a new translation of the Bible into English was requisite. He was King James VI of Scots, but in March 1603 his first cousin, twice removed, Queen Elizabeth I, had died, and that also made him King of England because he was her closest living relative, she having no children. Then he came down to England, and he called this conference for November 1603. However, bubonic plague erupted, so they had to delay it by a couple of months. So Hampton Court Palace, we're hard by the River Thames. You can see it just over there, beyond those trees. And we're about 20 miles southwest of London. I mean, these days it would be considered part of London, but in the 17th century this is in the countryside, well outside of London. And this palace was built by another ecclesiastic. It was Thomas Cardinal Wolsey, who was the Archbishop of York in the early 16th century. Now, York's 250 miles from here. How come his palace was down here? He did have Bishop's Thorpe Palace in York as well. Although, yes, he was Archbishop of York for about 20 years, Wolsey only went to York once in all that time. But anyway, cut to the chase. So, even when he was King of Scots, James I, he considered having a new translation of the Bible into English or perhaps Scots. Scots being a dialect, arguably a language, if it is a language, is very, very similar to English. But he didn't actually do that. He was obviously Supreme Governor of the Church of Scotland. Then he became here Supreme Governor and head of the Church of England as well. And he firmly believed in the divine right of kings. So the Church of England in the United States, its equivalent is the Episcopalian Church. Obviously, after the American Revolution, the Church of England in America became the Episcopalian Church. So it's certainly a Reformed church. Is it Protestant? That's debatable. Some members of it, some Anglicans, call themselves Protestants, others do not. And it was a debate that was going on in the 17th century as well. The word Protestant had only been invented some decades earlier. A few people, hardline Protestants, have split off the Church of England, set up other churches like the Baptist Church and so forth. And there was a tiny Catholic minority in England at the time, but they were persecuted by law. Some Anglicans were Puritans, as they believed in a pure lifestyle, no singing, no dancing. They thought there was really no such thing as innocent pleasure. They would tend to wear dark colours. They were against sports, eating too much, smoking. Tobacco was coming back from America. Well, not in 1603, not quite yet. They weren't against alcohol, actually, drinking small beer, because the river water's too foul to drink. But anyway, so there was a millenary petition, because it was supposedly signed by roughly 1,000 Anglican clergy, particularly those of the Puritan cast of mind. There were some Anglicans who were not Puritans, and there were some who you might even call Anglo-Catholics. So you've got to think in terms of sort of radicals and conservatives within the church, as in, are they to be fairly similar to the Catholic Church or very, very different? Anyway, so he met them here, James I, and Lancelot Andrewes was one of the leading figures. The Archbishop of Canterbury died during the conference. He was replaced with Bancroft, who was certainly an anti-Puritan. The military petition, they wanted various things. They said that women should be allowed to baptize babies, and it shouldn't necessarily be a priest, as in mother baptized the child as soon as the baby's born, but the king said no way. Some said let's get rid of bishops, that's too similar to Roman Catholicism, and James I strenuously disagreed. In Scotland, he'd already brought back the episcopate. He said no bishop, no king. If you get rid of bishops, then soon you'll get rid of the monarchy, because he wanted there to be this top-down power structure, and the church should mirror the state in that regard. The church and state were almost fused. Obviously, there was a national religion. If you weren't part of the national church, you weren't eligible for full membership of the nation or full rights. So religious discrimination was the norm really everywhere in the world until perhaps a century ago, and to some countries even to this day. Have you heard of Afghanistan? But anyway, one of the things they also had to settle was what they're going to do about the Bible. So there have been several translations of the Bible before, dating back to the Middle Ages. I think there was even an Anglo-Saxon one, but William Tyndale, his one of the later 14th century, didn't quite complete, but he died peacefully in his bed despite that. This was Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University, named in his honour, a sort of proto-Protestant. And later there was William Tyndale, in the early 16th century, who was burnt at the stake for doing that. Lord, open the King of England's eyes, he pleaded as he was being burnt. And there was Miles Coverdale's and so on. There'd been the Great Bible, which was authorised by King Henry VIII, and there'd been the Bishop's Bible, authorised by his daughter, the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. But those weren't satisfactory, and Henry VIII had changed his mind, saying the Bible shouldn't be publicly available. It had been chained up to the lectern in every church so anyone could go in and read it. Of course, a lot of people weren't literate back then, but if they at least heard it read aloud, they would comprehend it. But anyway, it was decided by James I that there ought to be the Bible available in a language understanded of the people, as he put it. So they set to work, and that was one of the few things that everybody could agree on. So the Puritans were satisfied with this as well. So 6 translation teams were set to work. And they had to go back to the original texts, as in the original languages. So classical Hebrew for most of the Old Testament, and then also they translated the Apocrypha too. And then there was Aramaic, which is related to Hebrew for the New Testament, and ancient Greek. And so there were 6 translation teams, 2 at Oxford University, 2 at Cambridge University, and 2 at Westminster. Westminster is right beside London. These days we consider it part of London, where Parliament is. That's officially the Palace of Westminster, Parliament. And so it took them 7 years to produce this. And the different teams, they weren't translating all of it. They were given different bits of it to translate. I'm not sure how much they coordinated, but some people thought it was a bit of a jumble. And it was debatable, what the accurate rendering of various words from these ancient languages was. But anyway, most people have widely praised it, saying it's lyrical, it's euphonious and so on, and does it convey things properly as it should do? It would be considered ungrammatical these days, like the loaves and the fishes. Of course, you must say fish unless you're distinguishing between different species of fish. But it's widely appreciated, read by some people to this day, and some Christians will tell you it's the only proper version of the Bible, even though the language is antique these days and wouldn't be comprehended by everyone anymore. So that was it, perhaps one of the major achievements of his reign, and it's warmly appreciated even by people who are militant atheists, such as the late Christopher Hitchens. And so it all began here at Hampton Court Palace, which has obviously been a royal palace since it was confiscated in 1530, just before Thomas Cardinal Wolsey died. And anyway, so that's how people call it the authorised version. But the name, the King James Bible, wasn't known until Thomas Hobbes started it, even though he didn't actually use those precise words. He said, is the Bible authorised by King James or something like that. And there have been some very minor revisions of it in the late 18th century. Not everybody values the King James Bible, think that they got a few things wrong, that it's too imprecise, that it moulded several words into one word it shouldn't have done, or these various different Hebrew words ought to have had different Hebrew to different English translations and not all been lumped together. And there was things like Shekinah, as in that cloud signifying the presence of God. And we don't have an English word for that, so did they just say cloud? Anyway, so that's enough for me. I hope you found that somewhat informative. So goodbye from Hampton Court Palace, which is open to the public most of the time. And I'm going back to my bicycle. It's well worth visiting. I've got other videos on Hampton Court Palace. There is so much more to say about it, the various monarchs who have lived there. So all sorts of things, going to see the Royal Chapel there, where these people will have worshipped. And some very distinguished figures were involved in the translation of that Bible. George Abbott, who subsequently became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a number of other very notable churchmen. So there were teams of about a dozen, each of those translation teams. Okay, so goodbye everyone. So please follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And thank you so much for your liberal donations on Patreon, PayPal. They're so urgently needed to sustain this channel. You can find me at PayPal at georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Callahan being spelled Callaghan. I told you I was beside the river, so I wasn't lying. Okay, goodbye.